book, The Catholic Church in American Culture, Why the Claims of Dan Brown Strike a Chord. The publisher is offering it at a reduced price of $19.95 today. Before and after this morning's talk, or rather now it has to be after, if in fact they're delivered. And again, from 11:30 to 1:30 outside the bookstore in Naples. Yes. Well, others may. Okay. Well, I'm not a professional pitchman. I'm not a smooth salesperson. So, but I will say this. If you purchase my book today, you will get, at no extra charge, this incredible stainless steel tomato slicer. And so don't miss it. Please call now. Operators are standing by. Thank you very much. Okay, well, there were two main issues that arose with respect to the Da Vinci Code, and that's what I would like to speak about today. And the first has to do with the claims about Mary Magdalene. And I'd like to look at those, and then I'll look at Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper. So let's first look at what Dan Brown, or rather, let's begin by looking at what Dan Brown claimed, of course, was that Mary Magdalene had been married to Jesus and had a child by him, and also that Jesus had intended for Mary Magdalene to be the head of the church, not Peter. So let's just begin by looking at what we actually know about Mary Magdalene, and then see how it came about that Dan Brown was able to make his claims, including the claim that Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute, as she has often been portrayed, continuously been portrayed in the Catholic Church up until 1969, when the Catholic Church silently, relatively silently, changed her designation. I shouldn't say silently, but they didn't announce it by any manner of means. They just dropped her former title. Mary Magdalene was one of the women who followed Jesus during his ministry. She was one of his, as it were to use a hip-hop term, part of his entourage. And this was very, very extraordinary. It was not customary at all for a Jewish teacher to have women disciples, and it was scandalous for a Jewish teacher to be traveling with women, to be traveling with unmarried women, which is what traditionally has been assumed about Mary Magdalene. We know that she had been healed by Jesus. She had had 7 demons cast out of her, 7 being the number of completeness or completion, meaning that not that there were necessarily 7 demons, but rather that she was under complete demonic control. Nowadays, some people would translate this as mental illness, emotional illness, or something of that sort. Then, after the ministry came to an end, she was one of those who stood beneath the cross after virtually all of the 12 had fled. She was there also at the burial and in one of the most moving passages of all Scripture, given to us in John's Gospel in great detail, she was the first to see the risen Lord after the resurrection. Oops. Oh, there we go. And Jesus tells her, "Do not hold on to me." He says he has not yet ascended to the Father. So one way of interpreting that would be that Jesus has not fully been transformed by the process of resurrection and ascension, and she must not hold him. Also, she must not hold on to her previous notions of the earthly Jesus and worldly teacher. Okay, so now she is told to go and bear witness to the disciples that he is risen. She goes and she says, if you read John's Gospel, "I have seen the Lord." This is the same form of words that St. Paul uses when he's challenged whether he is an authentic apostle. He says, "Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord?" Well, Mary would go on to be called in the Middle Ages the apostle to the apostles. Apostle means literally sent. She's the one sent to the apostles, so she's the apostle to the apostles. Nevertheless, when we go to St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, what do we find? This is the earliest record that we have of the gospel. This must be the form of the gospel that Paul was taught by Peter when he first went to Jerusalem. And he reminds them, "I passed on to you, Corinthians, what I received, which is of the greatest importance, that Christ died for our sins, as written in the Scriptures, that he was buried, and was raised to life on the third day, as written in the Scriptures, that he appeared to Peter and then to all 12 apostles." And here we see Mary Magdalene's name is omitted. And this can be interpreted as an early sign, as the Da Vinci Code would say, of this conflict between Peter and Mary. More probably, what is going on here is that, remember, the gospel was first preached to Jews, right? We have found the Messiah that the Jews had been waiting for, the Messiah foretold in sacred Scripture. And so, in Judaism at that time, women could not be witnesses. They had the status of children. Their witness did not count. So it may be that the earliest form of the gospel did not include women witnesses because they would not be accepted as witnesses. Any more than in some states, to this day, children are not acceptable as witnesses in a court of law. Okay, well, I think that's the reason for that, rather than any deliberate attempt to denigrate or demote Mary. Now, a question arises: why was it for nearly 2,000 years that Mary Magdalene was thought of always as a prostitute? The repentant prostitute, as in this Renaissance painting. And this is the way she is most often portrayed. And the reason for it is that she is associated with the woman who anointed Jesus' feet with perfume that came from her alabaster jar, which is shown and which is most often shown with pictures of Mary Magdalene. So she is identified with that person who is named Mary in some accounts, but in Luke's account, not named. And let me just say this with regards to Luke's account. Luke gives the account of the sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet. This scandalizes Simon the Pharisee, in whose home this anointing takes place, because she is a notorious sinner. Jesus ultimately says she loves much because she has been forgiven much. Now, in Luke's gospel, here she is portrayed again in that famous picture by Rubens. But in Luke's gospel, immediately after the story of the anointing, we get the identification of Mary Magdalene. So this is one reason why the two got conflated and merged in the imagination of some early church fathers, and especially Pope Gregory the Great in 591, when he gave a sermon in which he offered his view that all of these Marys were one. The Mary in Mark's gospel who anoints Jesus' feet, the unnamed sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet, and Mary Magdalene. But he offers it as his opinion. But his influence was so great that it was just accepted as the last word in the Catholic Church up until 1969. The Orthodox Church never made this mistake. Now you could see how it could have come about. Here we have Luke's gospel, but this is the what follows immediately after the story of the sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet. It says, sometime later, Jesus traveled through towns and villages, preaching the good news about the kingdom of God. The 12 disciples went with him, and so did some women who had been healed of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, who was called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had been driven out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza. The point is that if you read this carefully and you have recognized the way in which Luke writes, which is very, very carefully, Mary is being introduced to you for the very first time. Therefore, she is not the woman from the previous story. She's being introduced for the very first time. So Mary, from whom 7 demons had been driven out, is identified with the sinful woman. The 7 demons ultimately become associated with the 7 deadly sins, of which the premier, in her case, was lust, of course. So it was, I think, a simple and innocent mistake, which subsequently was repeated, and later, when various people tried to bring about change, for instance, in the late Middle Ages, they was said the church cannot change now. If we change on this, even if it could be demonstrated that a change was needed, the authority of the church would be called into question. So it remained. Now, the difficulty with this is that it becomes tied in with a view of women. At least there is a streak in the history of the Catholic Church in which, of course, women are regarded as inferior and as somehow or other sinful in a special sense in which men are not. Here is the classic passage. Admittedly, it has been taken out of context ever since. What the precise meaning originally may have been is unclear, but it may not have been intended as a general universal rule, but it was often taken this way. Here's the first letter of Timothy. he says women should learn in silence and all humility. I do not allow women to teach or to have authority over men. They must keep quiet. For Adam was created first, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, it was the woman who was deceived and broke God's law. So, woman is, after this, regarded as the one principally responsible for the fall of humanity. This, the church father Tertullian said, is why the Son of God had to come and die. It's all because of the woman. And we get this further difficulty for women in the church because when the clergy became celibate, women came to regard it as a very, very dangerous temptation. The one thing priests had to be very, very wary of would be the charms of women. Even the gaze of a woman, of an innocent woman, could cause a priest to fall. So, of all things, priests, this is John Chrysostom, many of the other fathers were deeply concerned that priests had to be very careful about women. So, what do we have? Oops, I don't want to go ahead that far. But there's a whole history, a dark thread running through the whole history of the church in which women are regarded as the source of temptation, diabolical temptation, okay? They're the one who were originally seduced by the devil. They can seduce men in the same way. Now, let me just give you what I regard as the worst quotation I've ever come across. This is from Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, the teacher of Thomas Aquinas. He was made a doctor of the church. He's one of the few official teachers of the church. Here's what he wrote about women in around 1220, but he's a Dominican friar, and he wrote about women. Woman is less qualified than man for moral behavior. When a woman has relations with a man, she would like, as much as possible, to be lying with another man at the same time. Woman knows nothing of fidelity. Woman is a misbegotten man and has a faulty and defective nature in comparison with his. Therefore, she is unsure of in herself. What she herself cannot get, she seeks to obtain through lying and diabolical deceptions. And so, to put it briefly, one must be on one's guard with every woman as if she were a poisonous snake and the horned devil. Her feelings drive women toward every evil, just as reason impels man toward all good. I love that last line, I really do. I've got to cut it out and made a poster of it on my... Well, at any rate, the trouble is, of course, that Albertus Magnus becomes one of the chief authorities for the notorious book mentioned in the Da Vinci Code, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, the manual that was used and distributed as a guide to how to find and prosecute witches. This was 1484. The book was prefaced by a papal letter approving the hunting of witches. And sadly, I mean, the papal approval of the search for witches was not written for this book, but nevertheless they used it in support of it. And sadly, it became the most widely circulated papal document for centuries because it was printed on this book. This book became the most popular book after the Bible for centuries, and it repeats these sorts of things about women. Now, and of course, it led to the witch hunts and the putting to death of many. Now, in defense of the church, one of the best researched books that I read wrote in defense of the Catholic Church and said that, hey, wait a minute, it wasn't just women who were put to death. There were some men as well. True. Perhaps as many as 20%. And the authors also criticized Dan Brown by saying, hey, wait a minute, they weren't all burnt at the stake. Okay, so Dan Brown has it totally wrong. Some were drowned, some were strangled. Again, Dan Brown is lying. And this is one of those cases where the church, I shouldn't say the church, although this book has a preface by Cardinal George of Chicago, but there are some things that should not be defended. Strangling women is not a really noble excuse for not having burnt them at the stake. And then, and this one hears occasionally, and listen, I'm telling you why Dan Brown resonated. I'm not really giving you the other side, okay? Time's limited. But I've also heard, even quite recently on EWE and the Catholic television station, the same argument that was used in this book. You know what? Despite all of the persecution of witches and the Crusades, the church never murdered as many people as Hitler, Stalin, or Pol Pot. And I thought, wow, isn't that wonderful? The followers of Jesus were not as murderous as Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot. Wow, what a tribute. So at any rate, sometimes defense of the church really, I think, does more harm than good. Let's just... Now, you might think this identification of women with evil, well, let me just tell you, it goes so far as here's a painting from about 1420 actually. Now look, here's Adam and Eve in the garden. Look at the serpent. Now maybe you think it's just a guy with long hair. Okay, I'm not going to argue with you, but take a look at this. Michelangelo, Sistine Chapel, the serpent, long flowing hair, and breasts. The serpent and the woman are one. So you see this identification with evil. This is one of those things that has given the church a reputation, okay? And this is the problem. It is perceived, it has been perceived as anti-women, as denigrating women. Okay, so at any rate, many people said when they read the Da Vinci Code that the idea that women were elevated, that they had a higher place in the life of Jesus, was something that resonated and made them feel good. Even although they realized some of the statements were not supportable, they nevertheless felt that here was somebody affirming women and acknowledging their role in Christianity as being important. And I think if you know, a case can be made that Mary Magdalene perhaps has not been given her due. And another point that feminists have tried to make is this. Mary Magdalene is like number 2 in the pantheon of the Catholic Church's women. Obviously, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is numero uno. But feminists have said, hey, wait a minute, look, the 2 most eminent women in the whole of the Catholic Church, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, are both in a typically male sexist fashion. They are defined in terms of their sexuality. Mary Magdalene, the prostitute, and the Virgin Mary. And they have tried to say that this is typical of what the church does. It views women solely in terms of sexuality. Obviously, you can respond to that. The Virgin Mary is portrayed in many, many, many other ways, and not just as the Virgin Mother of Jesus. But at any rate, that's the point that has often been made, and Dan Brown plays on it like a virtuoso. Now, very, very quickly, I'd like to say something about the claims that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. And what Dan Brown does, he quotes from these Gnostic documents. This was a Christian or semi-Christian group who believed that there was secret knowledge that had been passed on privately to Jesus' innermost disciples. These documents were found principally in Egypt right after World War II. They were found hidden. Here are the books. These are the earliest leather-bound books in existence from about 350 A.D. One of them that is cited in the Da Vinci Code is the Gospel of Mary. It's rather fragmentary. Most of the pages are missing. A small quote is given saying that Jesus loved Mary Magdalene more than all of his other disciples, and that he kissed her often, and Peter was very resentful that she should be held in a higher place than he and the others men were. Dan Brown also quotes one of the other Gospels, the Gospel of Philip, which says Jesus used to kiss her often on the word is missing, probably mouth. But even so, the trouble is, what you don't get is the context. I'm not going to go into it. But if you look at something like one of the other documents is called the Apocryphon of James. And in this, it features the one whom St. Paul calls James, the brother of the Lord. And in that document, you'll see Jesus kisses his brother James on the mouth. The point being, it's not romantic, it's a symbol of the imparting of special revelation. In other words, the one who has special insight into Jesus and God must be specially loved by Jesus and by God. And the symbol of this is the kissing. Okay, so it's not, even Elaine Pagels, Princeton scholar and best-selling New York Times author, has said this should not be understood in a romantic or sexual way. What these documents are affirming, however, is that there was another group or groups in which women were held in higher regard who did resent the Church of Peter. And one of the church fathers, Irenaeus, writing around 200, says that there are churches, these Gnostic churches, in which they even allow women to celebrate the Eucharist. So all of this goes together. There was this Gnostic group where women were given a higher place and where they could even celebrate the Eucharist, okay? But the idea of marriage is not implied, virtually cannot be implied in these texts. Well, let me just, in view of the time, okay, I'm going to leave it right there. So at any rate, Dan Brown played upon this widespread feeling that women have been denigrated and subordinated and put down and silenced in the history of the church. I showed you the passage from 1 Timothy, the first letter to Timothy, and that has been a recurrent theme. Sadly, a theme that has not been focused upon as much is John's Gospel, where Mary Magdalene is the one who makes the most important announcement in the whole history of Christianity. She goes to the disciples and says, I have seen the Lord. That really has not been given as much due as it might have been. I'm not suggesting that a woman should be pope or anything like that, but I'm just saying that historically, for all the honors that have been heaped upon Peter, really Mary Magdalene has got little honor in comparison, and indeed has been grossly misrepresented in the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, well, I want to move on very quickly to Leonardo da Vinci, and let's have a look at his that technician is no longer here, right? Oh, you are? Okay, I'm which? Okay, here it is. Here is the most famous painting in the entire world, after the Mona Lisa nowadays. But it was more famous than even the Mona Lisa up until the mid-19th century. So here is the Last Supper. It is so famous that we can even do parodies of it, and you'll still know what's being referred to. Oops. Star Wars version. Sopranos version. If you look up the Last Supper, you know, you'll find the Simpsons version of the Last Supper. It goes on endlessly. Now, so here we are. Now, sadly, this was completed when Leonardo was about 45 years old. He was asked to do this for a Dominican friary, and at one end of the rectory was a huge wall painting of the crucifixion that was already in place. He was asked to do one of the Last Supper, which he did on this wall, and he used an experimental technique which sadly did not work. So even in Leonardo's lifetime, it was deteriorating. And the greatest disaster in the history of painting is what it was regarded as even in his own lifetime. So it has been restored innumerable times, but these are restorations, and how much of Leonardo's original paint actually remains is very, very questionable. Now, one of the things was that Leonardo's painting was recognized instantaneously as a masterpiece, a work of sheer genius. So, from the very beginning, it was copied time and time and time again. Kings sent painters to make copies of the Last Supper. So we can get a clearer look at some of the details from these copies, because for the most part, these people were trying desperately to copy as exactly as possible. And even if there are errors, we can combine or compare various copies and see which must have been. So I'm going to begin by looking at the claim of Dan Brown that, hey, there is no chalice. There is the chalice used by Jesus at the Last Supper was, according to legend, the chalice that was used to capture Jesus' blood after the Roman soldier pierced his side. Okay, the chalice was used, gathered up by one of his followers, and so this chalice becomes the Holy Grail. Well, where is this magnificent chalice in this picture? It's not present, and the Da Vinci Code says it's not present because the Holy Grail is not a chalice, it's Mary Magdalene, who is in this picture. So the Holy Grail is here, but it's not what you thought. So let's look. Well, one of the things I want to point out, another thing is stress is placed upon the conflict between Peter and Mary Magdalene, which is indeed implied in some of the Gnostic texts. There is a clash between Peter and Mary Magdalene, symbolizing the Catholic Church, Peter, and the Gnostic Church, in which women are given a higher role, and they are regarded, they can be priests, they can be prophetesses. So supposedly Peter he's making a threatening gesture to Mary Magdalene as if to cut her throat, and there is a symbolic dagger in the picture. Well, all of this would be cleared up if somebody would actually look at the gospel text that Leonardo is believed by virtually all scholars to have been following. That is John 13. Leonardo, and of course all of these books presuppose you know nothing about the scriptures. Nothing. Now, if you read John, it says, and he focuses on that crucial moment in which Jesus says, one of you will betray me. And you get the various reactions of shock, dismay, and so forth on the part of the 12. In John's gospel, it says Peter, as it were, did something to the beloved disciple who was closer to Jesus, like tapped him on the shoulder, as it were. That's what's going on here. He's not symbolically slicing Mary Magdalene's throat. If you read the gospel, he nudges the beloved disciple and says, who does he mean? Because the beloved disciple is sitting right beside Jesus. So that's the simplest explanation rather than anything else. The dagger symbolizes what Peter is going to do. In a painting, you must compress time, as it were. The dagger is a foreshadowing of what Peter will do in the garden when Jesus is arrested. He cuts off the servant's ear. Again, in the gospel accounts. Now, here is another copying of the Last Supper in which I think it makes it a little bit clearer. You see Jesus reaching out towards a glass of wine and bread. So, in other words, this includes the wine and, as it were, the chalice. The chalice does not have to be something studded with diamonds and emeralds and rubies and made out of gold. Here, it's just a glass. Why cannot Jesus have used a glass just like the others? And that's what Leonardo thought. There he is, reaching out to the glass on the one hand, the bread on the other, symbolizing the institution of the Eucharist. So you do have the so-called chalice, or rather the container for the wine. So we do not need another Holy Grail in the form of Mary Magdalene. Now, that's a copy painted. I'm sorry, it doesn't come out as clear, so I'm going to bypass that. But that's the point I wish to make. Now, the question arises, is this figure sitting beside Jesus at the Last Supper, is it a woman? We notice the hair. Vidal Sassoon himself could hardly have given a better hairstyle than this apparently young lady has. Very sweet disposition, as you can see. But here you have Philip. I know it's not clear, but Philip also was traditionally understood to be very young. And he too has this flowing hair, flowing long hair, and features that would be regarded nowadays as rather girlish and effeminate. This is from the same painting. You get a clearer view if you look at, here is the draft drawing that Leonardo made for Philip, the basis of his portrait of Philip, his painted portrait in the Last Supper. And you can see, well, if you want to regard the figure beside Jesus as effeminate, so is Philip, if you want to look at it that way. Now, here we have I would just like to show you that this may be part of a trend in Florentine painting at this time. Painting in Florence followed certain conventions. Here we have Raphael's first painting, sometime after Leonardo's Last Supper. But nevertheless, we have various figures here at the foot of the cross. As you can see, we have from the left Mary, the mother of Jesus. Oddly, we have St. Jerome in this case. We have also Mary Magdalene kneeling. And then the fourth figure is, anyone? Who is that lovely and adorable young lady? It is John, the son of Zebedee. So this is as effeminate as anything in Leonardo. This is a convention. Think of it in this way. It is the same thing as what we have today, these exceptionally thin, or it's slightly changing, I suppose, but exceptionally thin supermodels. When, in the history of Western civilization, would that have been regarded as the epitome of beauty? Okay, these differ culturally. If you look at Rubens, paintings of beautiful women by Rubens, I mean, they would nowadays be considered obese, not beautiful. Okay, so there are different standards at different times. Here in Florence at the time of Leonardo, the ideal of youthful male beauty was what we would regard as rather girlish. That's simply their standard. That was predominant in that culture at that time. Oops. Now, if you look at so-called Mary Magdalene, really John, compare that with a drawing that Leonardo did of his protege, a young man. I think that protege of Leonardo's could well have been the model for John in the Last Supper. Long, flowing, curly hair. Even the tilt of the head is similar. So the idea that it's Mary Magdalene at the Last Supper is, I think, ruled out. In any case, the Dominican friars were not stupid. These paintings were meant for them to meditate upon in prayer and in their biblical readings. And they knew the scriptures inside out. They would hardly have been amused had Leonardo attempted some sort of stunt, as Dan Brown suggests. Now, let me just give you one other example. Here is a picture of John the Baptist, who was this rugged man out in the wilderness. He girded himself in camel's hair. He ate wild locusts, and he preached hellfire and brimstone sermons, right? Read any of the Gospels. Here is Leonardo's portrayal of John the Baptist. Get the point? Now, in all fairness to Leonardo, there were two traditions. There's the tradition of John the Baptist at the age of 30 when he's out there baptizing in the Jordan, and there is also the tradition of John the Baptist when he left home for the first time at about the age of 18. Okay? So it's like his senior photograph. That's what this would be, okay? So this is not how John looked when he was out in the wilderness, but nevertheless, it's a rather surprising portrayal. And I would like to, in 1 minute, I would like to once again mention my book. Have a look at the flyer that's been handed out if you're interested. I'll be selling it outside the Naples bookstore after, at 11:30 or even earlier. Now, what I would like to do at this point is, first of all, to thank you for your attention. And I'd also like to see if there are any questions. I've covered a lot of territory, and I'd like to see if there are any questions anybody would care to ask. Yes?
When you went back to the, I guess the Hammadi codices, the Gnostic Gospels.
Yes.
Yes, like the Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Thomas.
Yes.
Of Philip. To me, I don't know, that's what I guess I was wondering about the Vinci Code of Dan Brown. Did he basically write about it from the Gnostic point of view? Like there were the Gnostic Gospels, and then there were the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the Catholic Church seemed to adopt Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because it was based more on Jesus and men and things like that. And I find that the Dan Brown, like that's why it's separated. He took more of the Gnostic Gospels and wanted us to believe them.
Yes.
That portray, to bring so that all that goes on today in American culture is justified more. Like, I don't want to get into any topics and everything like that. But like homosexuality, things like that is based upon a lot, I think, from the Gnostic Gospels. And they wonder why we didn't adopt some of those into the Bible.
Yeah, well, first of all the evidence suggests that the Gnostic Gospels were written after all the other Gospels had been accepted. They had established their authority in the churches. These were secret Gospels. They do, I think we can say, what they reflect is a church in which women were held worthy of some high offices. This was at a time when the formal church, like if you read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, all of these are online, by the way. You can read Gospel of Mary Magdalene. It's very short, what we have of it. But she has special revelation, which she gives to the others. At this time, the Catholic Church was having great difficulty with prophets and prophetesses claiming new revelations. And the church believed revelation was completed with Jesus Christ. So to be coming along with strange teachings after 150 AD was very problematic for the church. How do you control it? How do you even decide? You see this problem already in the New Testament itself, the letters of St. John. How do you decide between different prophetesses in conflict who are both claiming to have the truth, to speak from the Spirit? And all the author, John, could say is, well, we know we have the truth, and they are liars.
But is that why the Illuminati was in Dan Brown's book was formed, and Opus Dei was formed to conflict, because that was the high, very pure Catholicism, Opus Dei, against the Illuminati, which was supposed to be all these guys he talks about in the book, like Vinci and all those. They had this secret society type of thing. Is that why all that was, you think?
Well,
Because I see in the book, that looks interesting, the Opus Dei conspiracy and things like that.
Well, I treated that separately as a cause of some scandal for the Catholic Church at about this time. But the Gnostics, if you really read them, you will see how absolutely bizarre they are. They, yes, he gives you excerpts which are striking and powerful, but if you go and then read them in their fullness, I think you will run into immense difficulties and agree that this is some very, very, very strange stuff in order to pass to the realm of light, you must pass through all these celestial spheres, and you must have secret passwords to get through the demons. It's very different from the Christianity that Jesus preached, so far as we know. Ultimately, you have to make your own decision. Are any of these authentic expressions of the teaching of Jesus? But I think there's certainly an immense conflict, and by any ordinary standards. However, these little slivers of light have been picked up by many people in recent, since the Gnostic Gospels and other documents were published, translated and published in the 1960s. They are, thanks to Dan Brown, they're now coming out in little cheap paperbacks, and they're being touted as alternative forms of Christianity that were oppressed by the Catholic Church. And gosh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had had that? And in a sense, we do, now that we've recovered them. But I think if you read them for yourself, you'll see they don't have much to offer unless you really want to take a flight of fancy, I mean, basically. They make one or two interesting points, that there was a church that valued women, and women as prophetesses, and women as church leaders. But the rest is bizarre, very alien to Jesus. It's nothing about, you must live a life of virtue. Doesn't matter one iota in those texts. Any other questions?
Other than the fact that Dan Brown elevated women in his portrayal, what do you think that his book struck such a chord?
There are a whole bunch. I look at 10 major issues in my book. Based on my own speaking and all I've read, I think that was one of the things that resonated most, this special elevation of women at a time when the Catholic Church the Vatican has shocked so many people by, for instance, declaring in 1994, when the Anglican Church was ordaining women to the priesthood, they decided to do that. The Catholic Church denounced that women will never be ordained in the Catholic Church. And after John Paul II stated that, a year later, a question was sent to the Vatican. Does that mean that that teaching is infallible? And Cardinal Ratzinger, the present Pope, responded, yes. But there were many other factors. I think just before the book came out, there was the sexual abuse scandal, which of 2002, which dominated the news. This also eroded or was perceived to undermine the Catholic Church. In the end, I looked at, because I think that's the basic issue, this notion of where is authority to be found. The Catholic Church claims it has the authority. Why? Because it was entrusted with the message of Jesus to preserve and promote that message. I mean, did Jesus just throw it in the air and say, well, it's up for grabs, take what you like and leave the rest? No, the Catholic Church says it was entrusted with it to preserve it and pass it on through the ages under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. But in America, with its strong sense of individuality, that seems to be predominant among many people. At the end of the day, even Catholics are willing to listen, but at the end of the day, they make up their own mind. I fell out of my seat when I read an article recently. I mean, maybe I'm just plain naive. But I read a statistic, very respectable, that 30% of Catholics who go to Mass regularly every single week, 30% believe abortion is okay in certain circumstances. And that kind of amazed me, because if there was any area where one would have thought people would readily accept the teaching of the Catholic Church, I would have thought it was that one. But the other areas now where the segments of the culture are are moving. All of these, some are mentioned in the Da Vinci Code, but some are not. I picked up all of the sexual teaching. I focus on homosexuality, where the culture, large segments of the culture are moving away. You know, for 1,800 years, homosexual activity carried the death penalty. You know, and then, for example, 150 years ago, Britain was very generously converted the penalty to life imprisonment. You also have this strain, which was staggering in American history, these great voices, starting with Thomas Jefferson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. These people were strongly opposed to the Catholic Church as the ultimate form of tyranny. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, a week before he died, wrote a letter in which he spoke about the Declaration of Independence and his lifelong affirmation of liberty. And that was against all forms of tyranny. And the chief form of tyranny is religious. It is the basis of all other tyrannies. So he's saying the Declaration of Independence, what he had in mind is church mind control. And he has statements, I put them in my book. You can put Sir Lee Teabing, the arch villain, Thomas Jefferson side by side. You would almost have thought Dan Brown is quoting Thomas Jefferson. Science, psychology is another one I deal with, because I think for many people in American society, it's all about personal fulfillment and personal happiness. And at the end of the day, if it's a choice between what the church says, for example, the church says, I'm sure John Paul II believed it was infallible teaching, no contraceptives, and you're thinking to yourself, gosh, I already have 15 children. The Catholic Church says you still cannot say, look, I value life and bringing life into the world. I've shown it. I've had 15 children. I now wish to have a peaceful old age and to use contraception to make sure of it. Nope. And many people just say, you know, I have to make a decision about what, in our society, what will make me happy and bring me personal fulfillment. And if it contradicts church teaching, so be it. I think that's a dominant strain in American culture. I'm just saying this as something descriptive, you know, like Oprah, right? Any religious idea, and I don't mean to, I don't wish to criticize at this point, but any religious idea that's helpful, that makes you feel better, good, and anything that makes you feel ashamed or guilty, and that, of course, has been one of the biggest attacks by psychology against the Catholic Church, that it sets the bar so high, it automatically makes people feel guilty and ashamed when they can't fulfill it. And this, according to the people who are opposed to the Catholic Church, they say this is an example of the church's attempt to control your mind. If you feel guilty, you'll keep coming back to the church. And of course, Dan Brown plays upon this notion of mind control. That's his whole thing, right? Catholic Church is into mind control. So I think there's a strong segment of American culture which is totally opposed to the Catholic Church, or perceives the Catholic Church as its supreme enemy. Science, some of science's views the Catholic Church this way, you know? Unfairly, really, very unfairly, but the Catholic Church is often lumped together with biblical fundamentalism, and it shouldn't be, but it is, and so religion is seen as the biggest obstacle in the way of the advance of science. Stem cell research, anything. So there is a lot, and I wrote my book for this reason. There were more, within 3 years of the Da Vinci Code coming out as a book, there were more than 50 books published debunking it. Just plain debunking it. More than 50. And nobody had asked the question, why then, if it has so many errors, is it resonating with so many people? Why are they cheering? Even if they know he's got a lot of his facts wrong. Even if he missed the bullseye time and time again, he at least appears to have been aiming in the right direction. He was touching a chord. And finally, one Episcopal bishop said, we need to listen. There is something for pastors to learn. If people prefer what Dan Brown has to say about Jesus to what they're preaching every Sunday, then it says something about our preaching and teaching. You know, maybe we need to do something a little bit better. But, and I'll say one other thing, and I know some people would criticize me for this, but 2 years after the Da Vinci Code came out, one of the top cardinals in the Vatican, he used to be the deputy for Cardinal Ratzinger. This is Cardinal Bertone. He came out 2 years after, and he said, the Da Vinci Code is a sack of lies. No one should read it. And he said, now this is obviously a little bit late, right? When the cardinal condemns it, says no one should read it, and all the bookstores should take it off their shelves immediately. Well, who knows how many more thousands of people ran out that very day to read this forbidden book. But Cardinal Bertone said, he said, the first lie that we have to explode, the first lie of Dan Brown we have to explode, is that the church is male-dominated. This is, here we see in a nutshell the gap between the Vatican and American culture. And I'm afraid the gap is, in my book, I think there's need for dialogue because, as we know, opposing parties are no longer listening to each other in our culture. And I do think each side needs to at least listen to what the other has to say. I think, you know, if I may just give one example, I published something recently, and one person attacked me very, very strongly. To what extent he had actually read what I had written, I'm not sure. But I wrote back to him and I said, one thing I said was, I will certainly think very carefully about all that you have written. I felt he misinterpreted me grossly. But nevertheless, he had an enormous amount of anger that he needed to express, and I decided and I told him, I will ponder what you have written very, very carefully. And I was rather amazed because he was really, really angry. But when I said this, his whole tone changed. Which reminds me, if you just offer to listen, that can change the whole tone of the dialogue, and I think that's what's needed. Because I think both sides, I mean, I know from teaching, I hear, and other talks I've given, there's so much polarization. One side says, look, there is no debate, there are no culture wars in America, there is no debate over who has ultimate authority. The debate is over. It's the Catholic Church and the Pope, and that's it. End of discussion. And then other people on the other side have said, I'm not exaggerating, you know, every priest is a pedophile, and they're convinced that the Pope has a mistress. You know, it's like, come on, let's... But that's what I feel, that there's need for some dialogue. Well, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.